The film which you are about to see is the account of the nightmarish disaster which befell a man in the middle of the dark ocean. Originally from the small town of Valley, Alabama, 28-year-old James Michael Grimes was your average hardworking man that worked construction for a living. James was also considered incredibly close to his family, as for every year for Thanksgiving and Christmas, the entire family gets together and celebrates like a big family reunion. And this time around for Thanksgiving, the family decided to take a cruise ship from New Orleans to Mexico through the Gulf of Mexico. Just wanting to have fun though, the family members weren't thinking about what could go wrong, as going overboard on a major cruise ship was so far from their minds that most were just ready to get drunk and have the time of their lives. On November 22nd, 2022, 2 days before Thanksgiving, James, along with 17 members, all from his mother's side of the family, all met up in Alabama and drove the 5 hours and 30 minutes down south to New Orleans, found multiple hotel rooms, and got ready for the next day. Then as November 23rd came around, the family was beyond excited and arrived at the loading dock several hours early and loaded onto the massive, beautiful Carnival Valor, which was owned by the Carnival Cruise Company. And as they were walking up the vessel, James couldn't help but to admire the enormity and grandness of the ship, though he was truly just ready to party, get drunk, and hang out with his family. Then as they all boarded the ship, they all found their rooms for the trip, unloaded their luggage, and began to explore the new massive vessel. And so for the first few hours, everything went perfect in their new accommodations. It wasn't until much later, around 8:15 p.m., that James decided to join several members of his family for dinner, and notably, this would be where James would have the first few of his beers of the night. And shortly after this, he suggested that he and a few family members go listen to some live music. As they got there though, James saw that there was an air guitar competition that was being held, and without even caring what the reward was, he told himself, why not enter this competition? And so he did just that. And about 2 hours later, around 10:35 p.m., he actually managed to win the competition. And for the prize, he actually received another free drink from the bar. Not thinking about the consequences of overdrinking though, James quickly grabbed his drink and starts high-fiving his cousins in the thoughts that this was going to be truly an amazing Thanksgiving that he would truly never forget. Though this feeling would only last a few more minutes, as without him even realizing it, his consciousness was slowly fading away as the alcoholic drinks were forcing him to black out for the rest of the night. It was now a little past midnight and James is starting to regain his consciousness. Though not fully aware of his surroundings, he slowly realizes that his body is extremely cold, as he feels like he's floating like in a dream. But then as he started to cough up water, he slowly started to realize exactly where he was, which his body then immediately sobered back up, allowing him to see the nightmarish scene all around him. In every direction was pitch black darkness. He was now in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, alone, scrambling his mind on how this could have happened, especially as he was just on the ship with his family. With no explanation though, all he could do for the moment was tread water and start immediately looking for some kind of light, or less likely, a dark outline of an island that he hopefully could be able to swim to. As he was looking around though, he also noticed that he couldn't hear out of his left ear. And as his mind was racing all around to think of what could have happened, he couldn't help but think how he could have possibly fell off the 6th floor of a massive ocean liner. That can't be, he thinks to himself. I wouldn't be alive. He then started to think where the ship even went to. He couldn't see anything, and he was completely surrounded in complete darkness. Then thinking to himself that he could most likely stay warmer without his heavy wet clothes, he begins to strip everything off, leaving only his boxers and shorts on to swim. He then started swimming into the direction of the light, thinking to himself, if it's not going too fast, maybe I can still catch it. Well, that was until it gradually disappeared into the darkness. It's now 3 a.m. and James has been treading water for well over 3 hours. You can do this. You've always been a good swimmer, he thinks to himself as he swims aimlessly in the dark void around him. And perhaps because of the panic behind finding himself in the middle of the ocean, the whole time he wasn't thinking about the many things that could be swimming in the dark with him. And eventually, as he was swimming, a jellyfish would smack into his legs, and at first he barely even noticed. But as the tentacles began getting stuck to his legs and neck, the realization of what was around him began to hit, but he soon after was able to peel them off and kept swimming in the direction that he saw the light in. Then, a little later, just after 6 a.m., James was just still treading water, though by this time he was welcoming the rising sun's heat on his skin, as he had been in the freezing water for well over 6 hours now. As he was floating, he then randomly saw another light off into the distance, and thinking that it might be an oil rig, he began swimming towards it as fast as he could, at least without using too much energy that he possibly could not afford to lose. Unfortunately though, as he was swimming, he would also slowly start to see large storm clouds forming overhead, and actually thinking that he may be able to outswim them, he begins to pick up the pace. And surprisingly, he notices that he's using less muscles actually swimming than what he was experiencing earlier just treading water. Though out of nowhere, the waves that he was forcing himself to swim over were suddenly becoming massive, and before he knew it, he was being pushed off course, and eventually the light that he could see off in the distance was unfortunately gone. As a few more hours went by, it would eventually turn 10:15 a.m., and James has now been in the water for over 10 hours now. He begins to think of his daughter, Annabeth, for strength, though also thinking to himself, I'm going to meet God soon. I'll soon close my eyes, and I'll be in heaven. A few minutes later though, he spots about 3 dim lights off in the distance that looks about a few miles away. And knowing that he may not get another chance at rescue, he begins to swim towards the light sources as fast as he can. And this time, swimming as hard as he could, he was able to get an incredible 300 yards from what looked to be a rather large oil rig. Unfortunately though, just as it was beginning to come into view, the waves all around him began to pick up and became behemoths once again. And before he even realized what was going on, the tide had turned and he was once again pushed back out to sea. And sadly, before he even knew it, the 3 lights were now growing smaller and smaller until eventually they were gone altogether. It was now a little past 12 p.m. and James had been in the water for well over 13 hours. James, now being half out of it, was floating aimlessly, and having not encountered any underwater animals other than the jellyfish from earlier, he wasn't too worried. Though after another hour of floating in the ocean, he felt something absolutely large brush past his leg, and his worst fears started to overtake him once again. He could tell that it wasn't a shark, but it was still enormous, and he could also tell that it had a large flat head. Then thinking to himself that he actually wants to see what is about to attack him, he takes a breath and dunks his head underwater, simultaneously kicking and waving his feet to try to scare it away, which was actually enough to scare the mysterious behemoth away. Unfortunately though, as he did so, he ran into another jellyfish pack, but luckily was able to once again get them off his limbs without too much injury. Then about another hour later, as James was still treading water and the sun was still beating down on his face, as well as hunger starting to take over his body, he almost couldn't help it but let his mind wander into some very dark places. Mainly that he should just give up and let the waves take him further out and eventually down under into the abyss. Another few minutes later though, he was able to see a small tree branch floating nearby, and desperate for any kind of nutrients that he could find, James swam over towards it, grabbed it, and started eating it like a Slim Jim. He thinks the taste is surprisingly tolerable, though I guess that's to be expected after 13 to 14 hours without a single drop of water or crumb to put on his tongue. A few hours later, it was now turning 3 p.m., and James had now been lost at sea for a dreadful 15 hours. And at this point, he was beginning to show true signs of dehydration, especially as he began this entire ordeal drunk, contributing further to his dehydration to the point that he would even give in and try to quench his thirst with the sea water around him. Just as expected though, after he took about 3 sips, he threw it back up almost immediately. He then began to wonder how long could he actually keep this up before he simply couldn't anymore. Then a little later he thought his prayers had been answered, as he was almost scared half to death by a cruise ship that was passing half a mile away from where his location was in the water. He tried desperately to get its attention, thinking that the ship had to be there to rescue him, though in all reality it was just a random ship, and no matter what he did to get its attention, the ship just kept cruising along until it eventually was a small dot on the horizon and eventually gone altogether. It's now 8 p.m. and James has been in the ocean for a mind-numbing 20 straight hours, and at this point he's just thinking to himself if sinking below the waves would be worth it or not. Then thinking of his daughter Annabeth again, he thought to himself, I'll give it a little longer. I can't give up now. And just then he was almost in complete shock at the sight of a large cargo ship in the distance, and feeling that this was possibly his last chance at rescue, he forced himself to swim over to it, making sure to get as close as possible. at least close enough to see the shapes of humans on the balcony. He then began to yell and wave his hands as hard as he possibly could, absolutely exhausting himself in the process. "Help," James yelled out. "Where are you?" he heard a voice calling back. "I'm in the water," James screamed back. Then, almost as fast as they saw him next to the ship, several people started throwing life rings towards James. Barely being able to reach him though, the men yelled to him to try his best to hang on for the next 15 minutes, as the Coast Guard had been searching for him and were already on their way. Then, as a few minutes passed by, a helicopter finally made its way past the horizon and began to circle the ship in an attempt to find James's body. "This can't be," James thought to himself. But luckily just then, the spotlight shined down onto him and he simultaneously heard a voice from above yell out, "We've got him." It's now 8:30 p.m. on November 24th, Thanksgiving Day, and James Grimes was finally out of the water after thinking he was destined for certain death. Unfortunately though, due to poor weather, the helicopter was forced to land in New Orleans Airport, where he was then able to be driven to a nearby hospital by an ambulance, where the first responders were absolutely amazed by the sheer luck of even being found in the ocean, let alone found after just one day, and at night at that. James would then go on to spend the next 5 days in the ICU. And would go on to say when asked what it was like to be in the ocean for 20 plus hours. "I figured after spending about 6 hours in the water, I might as well make it another 6, and then another 6. He then went on to say that, "I think my will to live was strong enough to save me. I believe I had about 2 more hours in the ocean before I went under." With that being said though, James Michael Grimes is definitely one of the luckiest people alive on this earth. And once again, thank you for watching. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.